Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to Social Justice Ireland's annual policy conference. This is the 33rd annual policy conference, or in this series of conferences. So a third of a century we've covered today. And on each occasion, each year, what we try to do is to pick a policy issue that's of importance or relevance that day and at that time, that year, and to try to bring some expertise and capacity to bear on it and present different viewpoints and different ideas about how that policy issue might be addressed or tackled or whatever. So as we were sitting down to discuss what to do in 2020, we had a situation this year that obviously we had an unprecedented year, and not just because of COVID, but principally because of COVID. I suppose there was a whole lot of other things that were happening, and from the point of view of Ireland, it was an interesting situation that at the start of the year, Ireland had was one of the richest countries in the world, as measured by GNP. Our unemployment was low, our population is growing. We have some really positive measurements, but at the same time, there are negatives, and those negatives were actually in there before COVID arrived. Poverty persists. We have a problem with the deficits in our infrastructure, our social services, and there were a number of other issues as well that were problematic. With the coming of COVID, there was a sort of a light cast, if you like, on the society, and a lot of things to see then whether or not we got a lot of opportunity to see what exactly was working and what wasn't working. And it became clear relatively soon that a great many people would be of the view that there's no going back to the old reality, that the new normal will not be the old normal. So we had to address some serious questions about, or Ireland has to address some serious questions. Others too, of course, have to address some serious questions about the future and what type of future we want to build, and what that future, what those priorities might be. And it was in that context that we took the idea of a new social contract and a new social dialogue. And those topics had been raised in the program for government, and we had been talking about them for some time anyway. So that was why we decided to take that focus today, and we're delighted to have the speakers that we have. We have an international session starting right now, and then we have another session following up in the late morning, in which we will have speakers, Irish speakers, and we will present an example of a social contract. And then in the afternoon, we have the leaders from the 5 pillars of social partnership, all discussing about setting out their views on a new social contract, a new social dialogue, and then discussing where they think things might come. And so it should be a very interesting day. And to anchor it, as always, we're delighted to welcome back Mick Clifford. Probably one of those people that doesn't need an introduction, but I might as well provide it just in case. There might be people who don't know him. He's an author. He's an investigative journalist. He works with the Irish Examiner, and he has been very prominent in Ireland. He was awarded the title Journalist of the Year in 2016 for his work on the Maurice McCabe case and the publications he did there and so on. 2 years previously on the television program, the TV3's Tonight with Vincent Brown program, they named him Journalist of the Year as well. That was in 2014 in their review of media that year. He does a lot of other things that I won't embarrass him by going on about, but including running a podcast series that has a huge listenership as well. So without any more ado, I hand you over to the capable hands of Mick Clifford. Mick.
Thanks very much, Sean, for that very generous introduction. Hello, everybody, and you're very welcome to what is a strange gathering for these strange times, but hopefully we'll ensure that it is no less invigorating for that. As you'll have seen, and as Sean mentioned, on our program today, we have 3 sessions. The first will run until 11:15. A 15-minute break will start promptly at 11:30 for the second session. After lunch, that'll run till 1 approximately. After lunch at 2 p.m. Third session will run until 4:30 with a 20-minute break in the middle, after which there'll be a panel discussion. Now, everybody should have received links to register for sessions 2 and 3. If you're on board, you've obviously obviously registered for session 1, but these links are also in the chat function in your Zoom, along with a link to a book of today's presentations. At the end of each session, we're going to have a Q&A, and because of our circumstances, the way we're operating at distance, it's going to be slightly different, and that means you're going to have to use the Q&A function in your Zoom, put your questions in there, they'll come through, and I will put them to the speakers. The Q&A for the first session will be after our second speaker, and we'll address it to both speakers at that time. Okay, so off we go, and we're starting with the international perspective on today's theme of a new social contract, a new social dialogue. Our first speaker is Anne Pettifer. Anne is best known for her prediction of the great financial crisis in the coming First World Debt Crisis. In 2008, she co-authored The Green New Deal. In 2017, Verso published The Production of Money, which is on the nature of money debt and the finance sector. She is also the author of The Case for the Green New Deal. She is an honorary doctorate from the University of Newcastle for her work leading an international movement for the cancellation of $150 billion of debt owed by 35 low-income countries. So Anne Pettifer, Anne, you're very welcome, and off you go.
It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you very much, Mick, and thank you also, Sean, for having me. It's a great honor, and I'm just sad that I'm not with you. It's always lovely to be able to travel to Dublin and to meet with my Irish friends. But today, we do our best with this new system. I have a PowerPoint presentation, only simply to illuminate some of the points that I want to make. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, start by sharing my screen and hope that the technology works. Yeah, it does. It does. So I want to talk today about the new social contract, which also has to be a new ecological contract, if you like. It has to be a contract which is broader than just society, but embraces the ecosystem as well. And I want to bring an international dimension to the discussion. I want to argue that we need to address the international system if we are to look at social justice at home, at the domestic level. So I want to begin with, oops, and now it's not working. It is. I want to begin with this extraordinary speech by Olaf Scholz, delivered in September this year, and obviously in reaction to the pandemic, in which he called for a more sovereign Europe, an ambitious, cohesive, and transformative recovery program, and argued we must recover together and use this opportunity to transform our economy. These are radical terms used: sovereign, ambitious, cohesive, and transformative. And we need to understand these terms in the international context. Whoops, no, nothing is happening. Why? Maybe Colette can help. I'm stuck. Sorry, here we go. So he talked also about strengthening the question of sovereignty, holding our own. And I think by using the term holding our own, he means our own values versus the United States and China. And who are forcefully asserting their national interests. So this was an unusual and important speech from the Vice Chancellor of Germany and the Federal Minister of Finance. And the question is, how are we going to do that? And it's ambitious and it's wonderful and it's obviously triggered by the pandemic, but how do we go about this? Oh dear, I'm stuck with my, something is not working, but anyway, let me try again. Help. Yeah. So I want to argue that if Europe is to recover, we need to transform the global order, the international financial architecture in which the Irish economy, for example, is nested. It does not exist in its own terms. It's nested inside a bigger architecture, one that's been deliberately designed. It's not there by accident. It's been deliberately designed. It's a global order, and we live within it. And if we are to transform the European economy, the Irish economy, if we are to achieve social justice, we have to begin by looking at this financial architecture and transforming that was what I'm arguing today. And of course, it's known by us all as globalization. And I feel also there's a great deal of confusion about it because the term is ambiguous. It has much about it that we like. We like the fact that we can go on the internet and purchase goods from Amazon and have them delivered the next day. We like the fact we can use our credit cards wherever. We like the fact that we can travel to interesting countries, or we could before the pandemic. And all of these are aspects of globalization that are very popular. But really, globalization is not about those interests and that convenience. It's more profound, in my view. It's a system like the gold standard of the 19th century and the 1920s. It's a system that is liberalized, and I use that word carefully, and that demands and extracts extraordinary capital gains from the fictitious commodities that are, on the one hand, money, which is a social construct, it's not a commodity, land, and I'm using land here in the very broadest sense of the word, that is finite. These are Earth's resources that are finite, and labor, which of course is human. This is a concept first cited by Karl Polanyi. To make capital gains from these valuable assets is the aim of the globalized system. And let me explain that a little bit more. Unlike commodities, money, land, and labor cannot be produced, right? Money isn't a commodity that you can dig up out of the ground. People used to think gold was money, but it isn't. Money has been and always has been, and certainly before 1694, when the Bank of England was created, it was simply a promise to pay. It's a social construct. It's something which says, I promise to pay you for the goods or the services that you've provided. And here is a coin or a credit card or a debit card or some other indication of my promise. If you pick up a £10 note, it says the promise to pay is on there. So these things which signify the promise, the social construct, the social arrangement, have taken on a life of their own, and people have thought that the thing that signifies is money, and it's not. When I walk into a coffee shop, when I'm able to walk into a coffee shop and I wave a card at a machine, I'm not handing my card to the owner of the coffee shop. I'm taking the card and putting it back in my pocket. And the card simply says, the bank verifies that Anne Pettifer can afford to pay for this coffee. That's what it is. It's simply a signifier of my social contract with the shopkeeper. Land similarly can't be produced. We can't create new Earth. We can't create a new planet. That is there and it's finite and its resources are finite. And labor, of course, can't be produced. Of course, Silicon Valley would contest that and say that they can produce robots which would undertake the work normally undertaken by human labor, but that's a delusion, and we need to be clear about that. It's the kind of utopia that Silicon Valley, those large globalized platforms in Silicon Valley, it's the kind of utopia that they are promoting, but that is actually a dystopia. So land, or the ecosystem, and this is the really crucial point as we face the environmental crisis, the breakdown of Earth's systems, not just climate breakdown, but also extinction, the threat of extinction. The land, or the ecosystem, is constrained by the laws of physics and is subject to the concept of entropy. In other words, the Earth's assets are, biophysical stock of resources are finite. And as James Clear has argued, in the long run, nothing escapes this physical law, the second law of thermodynamics. The pull of entropy is relentless. Everything decays, disorder always increases. When we burn wood, it does not disappear. It decays, it disintegrates, but it becomes something else. And so that is why that is a physical thing. That is the laws of physics that constrain land. But money or credit is quite different thing. It doesn't have those sorts of constraints. It's bound only by the mathematical laws of rent-seeking money creation. So the creation of money is a process which is almost effortless. It involves a licensed bank or a central bank agreeing to provide credit to the borrower on terms and conditions, i.e. with collateral, with a promise to pay, with a contract, and at a rate of interest, right? And we've empowered banks and central banks to provide this liquidity, this money, this credit over 400 years, because it's helped us undertake transactions, right? But it is bound only at the moment, especially under globalization, by the mathematical laws of money creation, of credit. It becomes debt and is compounded at a rate of interest that can grow exponentially, unlike land in the broadest sense of the word. So we live in a world where today, the amount of debt, the amount of credit we've created, which has become debt and which has also in many ways become unpayable debt, and which has expanded well beyond our capacity to generate the income to repay that credit, is because we've allowed the mathematical laws of credit to cause the amount of debt to expand exponentially relative to the fixed income, the fixed assets, if you like, that we have in the land and for labor. So this conflict between the finite resources of the earth and the almost infinite capacity of debt to compound itself is the clash that exists between the financial system and the ecosystem and the social systems, so social and political systems. And that is why it has been so vital throughout our history of creating and inventing and using money to regulate and manage money creation. Because if we don't do that, it can expand, as we know, almost effortlessly and well beyond the ability of repayment. And this becomes very clear when we look at what the banks are doing vis-a-vis the ecosystem right now. We know that in the 3 years after the Paris Club Agreement, JP Morgan Chase, which is the biggest bank in the world, lent $196 billion to the fossil fuel sector, to oil, gas, and coal companies. And if you compare that to Exxon, which is itself a fossil fuel company, it only invested $3 billion a year over 3 years, $9 billion in extracting oil. And we can see from that, therefore, that the banks play a much bigger role through lending in extracting fossil fuels and supporting the extraction of fossil fuels than do even the fossil fuel companies themselves. We don't know what is the rent on those loans or the interest. That's unknown. But what we do know is that in order for those fossil fuel companies to repay, they have to go on extracting oil, coal, and so on. Otherwise, and gas, because otherwise they will not be able to meet their obligation to JP Morgan Chase. And for me, this is at the very core of the crisis that we face, the conflict between our financial and economic system and the finite nature of our ecosystem. So if agribusiness has to repay loans to the banks, and in real terms, relative to the capacity of the earth to renew itself, those rates of interest are high. The agribusiness has to exploit the land, and we get what we see here, the growth, the expansion of soil erosion and erosion of the degradation of the land wherever we look. We have to fish the seas to earn the, extract and exploit the seas in order to earn the income needed to repay debts. And equally, we have to burn down our forests to earn, in the case of Brazil, Brazil desperately needs to earn US dollars in order to maintain her place in the global economy. So we find that this financial system drives the imperative for extraction of the earth's finite assets, and of course, the extraction of labor, the assets that labor provides too. That's where we see, long working hours, insecure pay, insecure conditions, very low pay, falling incomes, labor's share of the economy falling even as workers work longer hours and so on in order to meet obligations. So money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns, as Bill McKibben argued correctly. Until we deal with that oxygen, really trying to put out the fires is just simply tinkering at the edges. So the international system the international financial system enables banks to create credit almost in an unregulated way. Of course, there are regulations, but largely the system has been designed to liberalize, literally, to remove regulations on the financial system, the banking system, to encase, if you like, and insulate markets, especially financial markets, from democratic decision-making, from democratic regulation. So the financial system operates, if you like, out there in the stratosphere, whereas you and I have to operate here on land and pay our taxes and be regulated and stop at the lights when we're in our cars and so on. So we live within a regulated system, but the international system has been designed to encase markets and protect them, insulate them from democratic regulation and decision-making. And Quinn Slobodian has written the book about the way in which these ideas evolved in the 1920s. And we see this most clearly in the case of Ireland and of Europe. So Apple has not paid taxes, according to the EU Commission, the kind of taxes, the obligations that she has to the Irish state through, for whatever reason, and I don't want to go into why that is the case. I simply want to deal with the fact that Apple is a globalized company operating in the stratosphere that I've been talking about, and operating in a way that is beyond the reach of regulatory democracy. So when the European Commission sued Apple for the non-payment of 13 billion euros of debt, you know, there was a sense that this was fair, that it was about time that these great, big, huge platforms honored their obligations. But as we know also, the court, the General Court, the European Court, argued that Apple was entirely within its rights to seek to move something, apparently all the platforms have moved over time, something like $300 billion a year into Ireland in order to avoid paying taxes. And the courts ruled that the European Commission was wrong, that the law stated effectively, putting this very crudely, that Apple was free to move her profits wherever she liked, to erode the basis of a taxation system, and to shift profits wherever it was most profitable for the company. That, in a sense, is the law. And the European Commission was wrong to challenge the law. And as we know, that leads to social injustice. It made, I'm pretty sure, a lot of Irish people very angry, because $13 billion of tax revenues would be a very good thing, both for Ireland, but also for Europe. So this avoidance of taxation is something that is made possible by the international financial architecture, which prioritizes capital mobility over all other kinds of mobility. It's a system that subsidizes and protects encased capital markets from losses. And in this sense, it's almost anti-capitalist, because capitalism is supposedly about risk-taking, and risk-taking which forces the capitalist to make losses when he makes bad risks, or to make capital or gains when the risks come true and come out good for him. Now, this is the venue of the World Health Organization, and as you can see, I've chosen an image of shows it's empty. And what this represents for us is the failure of our world leaders to gather together internationally, to coordinate and cooperate to challenge the global pandemic, because the pandemic is global. It doesn't respect borders. But our world leaders failed dramatically to join in that kind of international coordination, and left the multilateral organization, which is WHO, out in the cold, largely. We saw world leaders like Bolsonaro and Trump clown around and refuse to convene an international summit to coordinate the response to a global pandemic. And that's proved disastrous. It's led to the deaths of many, many people, hundreds of thousands of people, and to morbidity rates for very much higher numbers. But by contrast, central bank technocrats, the officials, the civil servants that run our central banks, convened internationally to bail out the international financial system, capital markets. And they expended huge resources, uncountable resources, on bailing out the financial system. So there was the possibility of international coordination to bail out the banks, and the impossibility of international coordination to bail out the people, if you like, and to protect them from this global pandemic. And that tells us how this international system is so structured to defend the interests of the financial system, while exposing to risk the people of the planet, but also the planet itself. And we understand this, we've understood this for a long time. Alan Greenspan, who was the governor of the Federal Reserve, famously once said that thanks to globalization, policy decisions in the United States have been largely replaced by global market forces. National security aside, it hardly makes any difference who will be the next president. The world is governed by market forces, by the invisible hand of market forces, by the financial sector, which decides on interest rates, on the mobility of capital, whether or not capital will enter or leave a country. It decides on the value of the exchange rate. It makes all these enormously important decisions which affect the domestic economy. The world is governed not by democratic governments, not by international institutions, but by market forces. And this is the consequence. We're seeing more and more books appear. The Kleptomania on the left here is by Tom Burgess, who's a Financial Times journalist, explaining how corrupt is this unregulated, this lawless international financial system. Oliver Bullock's book is particularly good on Moneyland, and so is Nicholas Shaxson's. So more and more exposure, and then we've seen these enormous criminal activities, such as the vast fraud, which was the wired fraud across Europe, run by human traffickers, drug dealers, and so on. This is what happens when we have an international system which is detached from democratic oversight and regulation. And this also what happens when we don't manage the international financial system, when we allow that system to determine domestic outcomes. We have the rise of unemployment. And that has been the case in Europe since before the financial crisis in 2007-8, but Europe has had an unemployment consistently since then. And we try to hide it away. It's youth unemployment largely, but it's tragic and it's at a much greater scale than we are used to through history. And it's continuing to rise, of course, thanks to the virus. This is an image of Nissan workers who are likely to have lose their jobs when their factory closes soon. And at the same time as this rise in unemployment, we see this rise in the extraction of the Earth's assets, which is accelerating the 6 mass extinction, an event that could see the disintegration of civilization, scientists warn. We try not to hear these scientists. We try not to let it sink in. But the fact is, this is what we're facing if we continue to extract Earth's finite assets for the purpose of making capital gains for the 1%, if you like. And this is also why the soil is disappearing under our feet, right? We are degrading the land in order to extract enough income, enough revenue to repay debts, to maintain this international financial system. But the fact of the matter is, this is nothing new. We've been here before, and we were here and this is most stark in 1933, where the United States found that it faced this massive ecological crisis of across the Great Plains of the United States. Soil erosion had led to this thing called the Dust Bowl. And it was accompanied also by financial crisis, the huge financial crisis of 1929, and the huge rise in unemployment, which led to the Great Depression, which then caused social and political upheaval and led to a devastating, catastrophic world war, right? So we've been here before. But what's interesting about the United States in 1933 is this man, President Roosevelt came to power, was elected president in 1932, and he took office in early 1933. And on the night of his inauguration, he decided that in order to address the crisis of unemployment, of social injustice, and of ecological decline and degradation, we had to change the financial system, the international financial system. That time it was called the gold standard. And it was exactly the system we have today, but probably not on the same scale as we have today, i.e. this was a liberalized financial system with effectively with Wall Street in the driving seat of the economy. So on the night of his inauguration, he demanded that Wall Street hand over all its gold, the myth that actually gold was money, hand over all its gold, and that from now on, a democratically elected government was going to be in charge of all the major levers of the economy, and in particular, in his case, the exchange rate, the value of the dollar, the ability to raise finance, the cost, the price of finance, and the priorities of the state were going to be determined not by Wall Street, but by a democratically elected government. And his advisors said to him, hang on a minute, and this is a story that is not well told and that is not well understood, but a great historian, Eric Rauchway, has been working on this and has revealed how urgent Roosevelt thought this task was. His staff said to him, look, you can't go to the banks tomorrow and get them to hand over their gold because it's a Sunday. He'd been inaugurated on a Saturday and, you know, it's a holy day. He said, fine, we'll wait till Monday. So on Monday, they closed the banks, and that's conceived often as bailing out the banks. In fact, what he was doing was saying, I'm closing the banks. I want you to hand over your gold, and I want you to do it as quickly as possible. And there are terms and conditions to the extent to which the state is going to support you in future. And that began the process of dismantling the global financial architecture that had led to the catastrophes of the 1930s. In the words of his Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, we moved the financial capital from the City of London and Wall Street right to my desk at the Treasury. And that enabled Roosevelt to take control and to begin the process of investing in job creation, of increasing the incomes of American farmers, and of tackling the Dust Bowl. And he did that by employing huge numbers of people to plant trees. We believe they planted about 4 billion trees to begin to restore the soil, the health of the soil in the United States. But he also began to restore the economic health and social justice in the United States in that year. And that is why the model of the New Deal is so important to the Green New Deal. It's not just because of what was done relative to the Dust Bowl, it was also because of what was done in transforming the international financial system. So if we want, Mr. Scholz, a more sovereign Europe, one with more control over its economies, if we want an ambitious, cohesive and transformative recovery, we must begin by transforming the international financial system. In other words, as the Financial Times has argued, this is a time for capitalism to face a reset. Thank you very much. So I think I now end my speech.
Thanks very much for that, Anne. Thank you. A very interesting talk indeed. And you might stay with us because we might have a few questions following Philippe's presentation.
Sure.
Philippe Pochet is the Director General of the European Trade Union Institute. He's professor at the Université Catholique de Louvain and associated researcher at the Inter-University Research Centre on Globalization and Work. Prior to becoming director of the ETUI in 2008, he was director of the Observatory Social European for 16 years. He is interested in and has published extensively books and articles on European social and economic policies, European social dialogue, and new forms of governance. He is currently working on issues on the impact of climate change and digitalization on jobs, and seeking how to combine the analysis of these big trends. Philippe, you're very welcome, and we'll hear your presentation now.
Thank you, Mick, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and to share this slot with Anne. And if you remember, we were together last year in Palermo. It seems to be a completely different world now that we have to do our presentation by Zoom. And as you said, some of the research I did in the past. My first research was about Ireland. What I finished my studies, it was 83 to 84. And Ireland, the situation was dramatic at that time. People were moving to US, to Australia, to UK to find a job, and young people. And that's what was really my first research on Ireland. And then I returned to your country with the story of Social Pact. In 97, 2000, 2010, I coordinate books on Social Pact, and the Irish Social Pact, and you are part of, was so important, and so also giving a good example at that time for other attempt to strike a social pact in Europe. So that's the, I will use that in my conclusion on Social Pact to give you some reflection. But basically what I would like to do is three parts. And the first part is a reflection where we are at European level, because I'm specialist of European level. What are the challenges and what is at stake in the current period? Secondly, I would like to develop 4 scenarios for the future. And I think that we all share that we hope that one of the scenarios, the good one, will be the one that we will follow collectively. But I think it's important to see the alternative and not the so rosy alternative that we could have from the COVID crisis. At least I hope it helps us collectively to face some of the challenges if we are not following a more green and social future. And finally, as the title of this meeting conference, to have some reflection on social pacts, social contracts for the future. But let's start with the EU level. And what is fascinating here at the EU level, I think if you think what is the EU, what is different in the EU, I think it's from the national state. I think there is 3 distinctive features. The first one is this really freedom of movement. Europe was created since the Treaty of Rome on the idea of freedom of movement, first of workers, and secondly of all the citizens. I speak internally. Second idea which characterizes Europe is the euro. And we are the only experiment when we have a common currency without solidarity, without a political union. In the past never existed, and when it exists, didn't last so long. So that second really clear feature is the creation of a monetary union. And the third one was all the policy around the state aids and to control what the state can, how can the state help companies or help sectors or fund some public services. And I think these 3 elements characterize what is different in Europe. What is the 3 main pillars, I said, 3 main pillars of the European integration. And what is interesting with COVID is the three pillars were completely challenges. And I think that we have to think about that and see what could be the next step. And the first one is the free movement of people, of citizens. And the first phase of the COVID was, for me, rather fascinating, when you had new border. And we consider that a foreigner, which I mean for Belgium could be someone from the Netherlands, from Luxembourg, for France, from Ireland, which should be a fellow citizen, should have different right to enter the territory. And we close the border. And that's interesting because that's the pillar of the construction, the kind of obsession, including by the Court of Justice, about free movement. And after 60 years, we should have thought that we are a common space when we will consider that if you are coming from another country, you should enter the territory because you have the same right. It was not at all what happened. It was really closing territory. And closing territory, I think, changed completely this idea of freedom of movement. And now it seems to be a little bit more relaxed, a little bit easier to move. You have just to understand what is green, orange, yellow, and red, and to see what are the consequences. But I think that's a question how we consider at European level for the future the other citizen. And the crisis, the COVID crisis, gave us a lesson that perhaps we don't consider the other as an equal, but as a danger if there is a continuation of the pandemic or another pandemic. And we are ready to close the border. And I think it's important because the story will not stop with the vaccine or in the next months. It will be also how we open or not the external border. What we will consider what we have to protect. And if you see the situation in China, and I will return to China in my different scenario, you can see that they have closed the border. They solved the problem internally. You have still free movement within the Chinese province, but you cannot enter China, or very difficultly. At least in Belgium, you cannot enter due to the situation in Belgium. So I think we have to think about the border and how the COVID changed the perception of who is the other and what will happen in the future. The second point is linked to the EMU, and I work a lot on the EMU and the social side and the asymmetrical shock and all that we had at the end in the previous crisis. And there we have also a complete change, because who from the left could have thought that the Stability and Growth Pact will be suspended? Okay, in your dreams, we say, okay, we would like to have that, but we knew that it would be very difficult and that there is no political coalition to support that. But with the COVID, this kind of basic of the EMU, that you cannot have debt, that you have the Stability Growth Pact is something that the German will never abandon and will keep until the end, or until a lot of different fights, where one night stopped. And now it seems that the debt has no importance. If we compare the previous crisis and this crisis, in Belgium we have a huge level of debt, and we are used to have 100%, but no, I think we have 20% more, but nobody is not part of in the political debate, and in none of the country is really at the center of the political debate. It seems that because the interest rates are very low, there is no problem with the debt. And I will return to that because it's a sea change, I think. Or it's perceived. We don't know if it will continue, but could have adverse consequences if we don't pay enough attention now about the risk, or at least or it could be utilized in a near future. And equally, we have new instruments at European level, sure, to loans to help the unemployment insurance. Yes, it's loans. Yes, it is completely imperfect. No, not all the countries are there. It's not redistribution. It's not stabilization. But it's the first time that we have something at European level which is supposed to help. I'm not sure it will help, but it's supposed to help the national finance and the countries, and is direct to the unemployment system, which is also a sea change. There is a debate within the people following the social challenge of the EMU about we should have a kind of a European insurance reinsurance system for the unemployment because of the risk of being in a monetary union. Was already in the debate in the 90s. And now we have the first step. The same with the budget. And here it's no longer loans, it could be grant. Yes, it's not enough. Yes, there is still problem with Poland and Hungary, but it's also a sea change in the discourse about what is the EMU, what we are building. What is not sure is that it will last, because we know there is some countries that say, okay, it's for 2 or 3 years, it's not a structural change. But I think when we compare with the crisis of 2008, it's completely different. And as you mentioned, and the kind of the German, the approach of the German is radically different, and so surprisingly different, because nobody expected that they were so open, and they will consider that what is at stake is the European project, and then to move from this kind of obsession they had about the monetary union. And the last one is all the state aids that was completely relaxed. Yes, for sure, it helps some airlines company or company that will not like that, that they should not necessarily receive some aids. But once again, it's a sea change in the perception of what Europe can do or not do. Before there was discussion, could local authorities subsidize some public transportation, yes or no? I think the conversation from now will be or should be completely different. So my first point is we enter at European level in a different world, in a world which there is different opportunities on state aids and EMU. There is risk, I think, on the free movement of people, of citizens, as it was shown. But we have perhaps to rethink what is possible to have at European level, and or we can fix the step forward at European level, and be sure that we will not return to normal in a few months or 2 or 3 years. And from there, I would like to develop four scenarios. And the first one is the return to austerity, exactly the contrary of what I said. The second one is what I say, the Chinese path is kind of protective authoritarian states. The third one would be expense at all costs, kind of neo-Keynesianism without green, but la belle époque, okay, there is no future, let's spend. And the fourth one would be the green and social transition. But the green and social transition, I insist, is one of my scenario. It's not the most probable. We all, I think, hope that will be the scenario, but let's examine the other one. The return of austerity, as I said, I'm so surprised that even the liberal and ECFIN and the ECB say, oh, that is not a problem. But what will happen when the situation will be normalized, let's say, 22, and we will discover that most of the country have increased their debt by 30%. I'm rather sure that we will have, and we see already some part of the discourse to say, okay, now it's time to repay the debt. And it's time to repay the debt by austerity. They will call that perhaps differently. But the social forces that were for the austerity 15 years ago and that dominate the landscape since Reagan and Thatcher have not disappeared with the COVID. They don't express, and they are not part of the main narrative, but they have not disappeared. And as Colin Crouch said, there is a strange non-death of neoliberalism, the last crisis. And if we return to the situation in 2008, in 2008 we had also the idea that we can have kind of green Keynesianism, that we can go out of the crisis and have a very different path, and that the left will win. And what happened, and I think that's important to remember, it's in 2011, in 2012, most of the government in Europe were on the right side, center and right side. You had 23 government in 2012 who were in the center right or on the right side of the political spectrum. And that's also something that we have to think, or we can avoid to return to this pathway to austerity. The second one is the Chinese path. So it's a kind of mix of authoritarianism and protection. You say, okay, pandemic is there. I can protect you, but there is a cost for public freedoms, public liberties. But if you accept that, then we will be efficient and protect you against the risk. And I think that's that if you see the situation and you compare, for example, the situation in US before the new president and in China, that's clear that the situation is under control in China and not under control for a long time in US. So you can have this kind of discourse that we have already in some of the countries, Poland, Hungary, but not only there, to say, okay, let's have a trade-off, that kind of more authoritarian, more control, and also using the artificial intelligence to control what we are doing, but in exchange, you will be protected, and you will be protected against the COVID, but you could be also protected, and then we return to who is the other. You can be protected against the other, and the other could be outside of Europe, but could be inside of Europe too. The fourth one, the third one, is the scenario that we go to spend, and we say, okay, let's return to normality. But normality, the different from this scenario and the first one, is that you don't have necessarily austerity. We spend. We decide that to return to grow, we have to spend. And if you look to the discourse, all the discourse are, we have to have a huge growth next year. So we have to spend. Why are you not spending and buying clothes? Why are you spending and not going to the restaurant or traveling again? And that would be a kind of new normality that we have to spend to have growth, and growth is supposed to reduce the debt. But the risk with this scenario, if it doesn't work, you can say at one point, is because you have not enough flexibility, it's because the wages are too high, and you return to the austerity scenario. And I finish with the last scenario, which is the scenario for a green and social future. And it seems to be the right scenario, but it will not be easy. And it will not be easy because you have to do that in a period when the unemployment rate will be high. This year is still under control, but next year, when most of the measures supporting the short-term work will disappear, you will have an increase of unemployment. So you have to take difficult decisions about the economic structure at a moment when the situation will not be so rosy, and I think will create more difficulty than if you were in a normal situation. So in this situation, it's not about the question of coal or of miner. For me, it's the question for the key example is the car industry, because the coal miner in Europe, more or less there is 500,000 of people working in the mine, which is the statistical error in the workforce at European level. But if you take the car industry, is 12 to 14 million all in all working that. What is the future of the car industry if we go to green? Most probably, if we want to avoid to have traffic jam in electric car, it will be much less car and then much more unemployment in that sector. So that's change the perspective. And with this perspective, I think that we have to highlight two key points. The first one is the reduction of working time. If we go for the fourth scenario, you cannot go for the first scenario without having some reflection about working time and the reduction of working time. There, what is interesting is that IG Metall, the main trade unions in Europe, decide to fight for the reduction of working time. And now the negotiator yesterday in one of the key regions decided of a huge majority to endorse the reduction of working time as a key target of the trade union. But I think that the link between this scenario and the working time reduction should be really rethink. The second one is about globalization and deglobalization. And I think here that's clear that in the scenario that we want to like to support to have a new social and green contract, we have to speak about trade and we have to speak about globalization. And we have to see how we can reduce the exchange in a way. What is important here is that you can have two kinds of deglobalization. You can have a deglobalization, what I call a competitive one. So you still try to have more share of market in other countries, or you can have a cooperative one. The cooperative one is the one who have the same goal, to reduce the emission of CO2. But you will do that region by region in cooperation. And I think that is the start of a reflection, but we have to think about what is the future of trade, what is the future of regional bloc, and how we avoid to have three competitive bloc fighting to be more competitive, and instead to have the some cooperation. And I finish. I think I'm still few minutes to finish to think about the next step. The situation is changing at European level. There is different scenario. The one that I suppose most of you is supporting is not so easy, but need to have some in-depth reflection. But what could be the next step linked to the social contract, which is the theme of this conference? And I think for this theme of green transition, there is two ways forward, and both are interesting, but I will develop only one. One is that you have to politicize that, and then the future, you need to have tension, you have to have a clear project, which is this transition, and you have to construct the fight, because inequalities. You will not ever change if you accept so huge inequalities that we have now, and increasing inequalities even since the start of the COVID. And if you take this way, that's clear that with inequalities, you will have a fight, because Bezos will not say, okay, I want to be taxed at 95%. That's one way. The other way, and I finish with that, is to create some consensus, and is to go beyond just transition, because just transition, I think it's interesting as a concept. It's so interesting that people can support that from different, but it's not enough. I think what we have to think, if we want to have a new consensus, is kind of new social contract or a new social pact, because we have to rebuild something which is not depending of the election, is something, a contract that will last for the next decade, that we agree. As in many countries, we had such contract after the Second War. Each time there is a war, you have a kind of new contract between the different forces, which means that you need to have multiple conversation and partnership. And that, I think, what was interesting in the social pact in Ireland, because you have the third sector, NGOs, trade unions, employers, you had this already this tradition to have this interesting conversation between different forces. And I think that, and I should finish with that, is that the way forward. And the way forward is not only conversation, but innovations. So exploring a new way of working. And once again, from what I know from the social pact in the past, because you stopped with the previous crisis in Ireland, there was a lot of discussion about innovation in the different group of social pact. So perhaps in the future, some experience you had in the past, which were successful, could be reused and rethink for the future. Thank you.
Yeah. Philippe, thank you very much. Thank you for that. Very interesting, and particularly your observations on the social partnership. And we'll have some participants later in the day who have direct experience of that and will have very interesting views. But thank you very much for that perspective, and for yours. If you could stay with us just for a couple of minutes, I'll just go through some of the questions we've had in from some of our attendees. And I might get you to address them, perhaps the ones that are most suited. I think Anne in particular, I just read out a few of them, Anne, before you respond, but I think this one in particular is in relation to your paper from John McGeady. The creation of the New Deal relied on a strong executive with global influence in the form of the US presidency. How do we achieve such concerted effort in the EU, given that we lack such an executive? Which is interesting. Before we get to that, and just a couple of other that probably both of you might address, and Philippe as well. One here, where do you feel, this is from Faye Hayden, where do you feel social enterprises fit into the social contract, and what risks does it bring? Also, we have an anonymous question here from, if unemployment is high, isn't it the right time to engage all sectors of society in a social dialogue process to ensure that nobody is left behind? And also, and it's an overall, I suppose, one, and cogent one from Sean Healy himself, and that is, what should Ireland's policymakers prioritise if they wish to address the needs for transformative economic policies for Europe? And if I could turn to you first, if you could address some of those, just, we're a small bit tight for time, if we could keep it to about 4 or 5 minutes each, if you could, please. And in particular, I think there's an interesting question there in relation to the comparisons you made with the New Deal, but the fact that it would appear we don't have as strong an executive as Roosevelt was able to exercise back in the 30s. And you're mute.
Sorry, I beg your pardon.
You're okay.
So sorry, yes, that is true. We don't have in Europe the strong executive that they had in the 1930s, but we don't have in Europe the democracy they had in 1930s as well. So one of the reasons, and I think that's point that Philippe touched on, one of the reasons we've had borders maintained in Europe is that we don't have institutions trusted by the people to represent at the central executive level. And we need to democratize those institutions in order to have that authority. But we already see with the European Commission's and Mrs. van der Leyen's initiative in relation to the Green Deal, that it's possible for 27 countries to come together around a single goal, around a single number of goals, and in a concerted way, to have the kind of concerted effort that John McGeady mentions, to have that to overcome the crisis of the climate and to overcome unemployment and to stabilize the whole system. Now, we have finally seen the German government understand the imperative for this and had to be taught by the pandemic of that imperative. So it's possible for 27 states, and that's what's exciting for me, is that there are 27 states who could come together in a concerted effort to bring about a transformation. Now, of course, we see already 2 states trying to undermine that effort, but it's possible. It's not possible for Britain, which is a little island and wants to make itself more of an island, to undertake that kind of effort. So that's why we look to Europe, because Europe's values are rooted in democracy, are rooted in values that are shared widely, and it is possible to bring that together. So what should policymakers in Ireland prioritize? I would say there's a simple answer to that question. It's simple for me to say anyway. And that policymakers of Ireland should be prioritizing the interests of the people of Ireland, of the domestic economy. And I heard what Philippe said about borders. But the fact of the matter is that the global financial system hates borders. Markets hate borders. They don't want any barrier to their movement, to their ability to shift profits here or there, to shift trade here or there, right? But policy requires borders. Taxation policy, who am I going to tax if I'm an Irish politician? I can't tax the Brazilians and I can't tax the Taiwanese, right? I can only tax people with them. How do I determine pension policy? I require a border for that. Who is going to get a pension, an Irish pension? How do I determine criminal justice policy? If I have no borders, what's to stop criminals just walking across the border and escaping my justice system? So we have a problem in that policy making by the people of Ireland, or the governments of Ireland, requires borders. But that doesn't mean to say that it can't be internationally coordinated and that we can't cooperate internationally. But for me, the problem with globalization is that the Irish government now, and forgive me for being so critical, the Irish government is now prioritizing the interests of Apple, for example, of the international financial system, not the interests of the people of Ireland, not the domestic interests of the economy. And they may say that they are, because Apple has moved $110 billion into Ireland, and that's created jobs and created tax revenues. But ultimately, the interests of the people of Ireland are failed by prioritizing the interests of Apple.
Thanks, Anne. I don't think anybody will have any problem with you being critical of the government's approach in that respect. Philippe, if I could just turn to you in particular, what policymakers should prioritize, and also perhaps where do you feel that social enterprises fit into the social contract?
Yeah, I think that's the, for what should be the priority. I think we are confronted for something that it's not the classical transition. The transition, you can have you have a vote, you have a majority, and you change the system during 4, 5 years, 10 years, and then there is another government. Here we have to change the system in a systematic way, in a current way, for the next for the next decade. And that's something completely new for a government. It's not to win the election by 2 or 5%. That's easy to do. It's to put the society in the right track. And I give you the example, because it's nice that at European level we are discussing, should we reduce the emission by 40% or 50? Could we say 55? Yes, we say 55, good. And some say 60. Okay, in 3 decades, we reduce the emission by 25%. In 10 years now, we aim to reduce by 30%. We enter in a serious game there. If you take that seriously, that we will do that, then it changed the society. It's not just to change some bulb to close the light when you go out and some small thing. We enter in some different society. And I think that the government should have to return, and I think with the COVID, perhaps there is some hope to have some kind of planning for the future. We have to plan what will be the next decade and not to know what will be the next month or the next day, as so many governments are doing. And secondly, I think that we will have 3 ways, and that's my future article, so I test my idea with you, 3 ways of just transition. You will have the Chinese just transition led by the state. There will be no democracy. They say we will have a just transition to zero emission, but controlled by the Communist Party. You have the new Biden group that say we will do that by the market. And if you say it's easy because the kind of solar panel and wind energy is already less costly than coal and will be very soon less than gas. So it will be by the market. And we have here in Europe to see what kind of just transition we want to do. And the just transition that are promoted in Europe and that I think we have really, and social enterprise are part of this discussion, is how we link the environmental goal and the social goal. It's easy to say, yes, we will do and put a name, just transition. But when you do, you say concretely what you want to do exactly. What is the impact on welfare states, for example? Nobody is working that. What is the link between labor law and environmental law? Nobody is working. So I think that we have to invent something new, but knowing that we will be in competition with other transition, one purely by the market, US, and one purely by the state and the Communist Party in China. And the one that we will try to invent will be not the only one. So we will also to think how we can reorganize this conversation internally, but also externally, because if not, we will be completely marginalized. And so in social enterprise, I think all the kind of experiment that we had in the past are interesting to put that in this debate.
Philippe, thank you very much, and a very interesting perspective indeed. Just folks, just to point out, you may well have spotted yourselves and the chat function, just a couple of comments from Alex Piggott. We have, regarding Apple, it should be realised that the profits made by the company, as reported by the company in Ireland, were made across the world, not just in Ireland. If we want globalised companies to pay tax on their profits, it requires international cooperation and new methods to calculate where profits are made, not where they are reported. And a very cogent point there, I'll have to say. Also from Miles Caulfield, a reset of capitalism would be even more difficult for Ireland to influence than it would be for an individual to influence the financial order in Ireland. That's interesting perspective, but I suppose one could reply that we have punched above our weight in other respects, so why not in this regard? Philippe Pochet and Anne Pettifer, thank you both very much for that international perspective on our theme of new social contract and new social dialogue.